Hello everyone and welcome back. As you may know, this is the very first episode that I'm doing that splits my DM advice episodes in two, so that I may make slightly shorter, more digestible episodes for all of you. They will still be standalone to the extent that they would be anyway, meaning that you won't have to watch one to understand the other, but still, feel free to check them both out. As I said last week, I am posting this as 2 episodes on YouTube and as 1 to podcast platforms, but this is the only week that I'll be doing this. I'm going to make them 2 episodes in podcast platforms as well as YouTube from next week and on out as well. And as I also said, I'm going to be experimenting with publishing them on separate days as well. So as always, feel free to let me know what you think in the comments, again, if you're listening to this on YouTube. But with all that out of the way, let's move on with today's topic, which is why our encounters might be falling a little flat according to my 3-part encounter structure. So let's learn something. First, for a quick review, what do I mean by 3-part encounter structure? Well, I believe that any good encounter has 3 major parts: the hook, the goal, and the action. The hook is what lures your players into the encounter, the goal is what gives them direction, and the action is the challenge. It's the part of the world or the story that tries to stop them from achieving whatever it is they set out to achieve. This can apply to big overarching plot ideas and story arcs and adventures, as well as to small scale encounters. The larger scale stuff is more dependent on your individual campaign, so I'm going to focus on smaller scale encounters examples for this episode. But this method of focusing on smaller scale stuff also makes some things a little clearer, as simplifying example often does. But just know that this stuff largely and generally applies to more large scale stuff as well. So let's start with the hook. This one's a little bit difficult to come up with an example for, because I find that DMs do this pretty naturally, and besides, a lot of the problem with player involvement doesn't necessarily always come from the lack of a hook. Often it's because you missed the goal, but more on that next. What can happen if you leave out the goal? Not the goal, sorry, the hook. What can happen if you leave out the hook? Well, let's run through a quick example. Let's say that you want your players to help out in some war or otherwise get caught up in it. A good hook would be them being in a town that gets attacked. Bonus points if the town is related to one or more of your players. If you just say there's a war but don't actually show the players, how can they ever get involved? The same goes for someone giving them a quest. Maybe they meet someone in a tavern somewhere. If they just talk to the players that actually give them anything to do, there's no hook. These may seem kind of obvious and kind of common sense, and yeah, they are, but it's still good to keep it in the back of your mind. You'll also find that, like I said, the hook and the goal are very similar, and they are very related to one another. I mentioned the example in my episode on interesting engaging encounters that follows a bridge that your players need to cross. Obviously, crossing the bridge is the goal, and I'd say that whatever's on the other side of the bridge that they want to get across to get to creates the hook for them, whether it be safety, a monster they need to fight, or some kind of treasure or whatever else. And this probably is the case for most organic situations. But you'll find that if you try to remove this, or if we forget to include this in the first place, then you'll also leave out the goal. This is why I say that the hook and the goal, one of the many reasons why I say the hook and the goal are so closely related in most cases. Neglecting the goal is most often what takes away the force that really guides their actions. So let's examine that next. Let's start with the bridge example. If your players need to cross the bridge, ask yourself why. Really, if they need to do anything, ask yourself why, and if you can't answer that, then there's no goal. But with the bridge, what's on the other side? Nothing? Then why would they cross it? Especially if this encounter still has its action. Why would they risk a challenge if there's nothing to gain from it? This applies even if the goal is just to simply get to safety. Make the way across the bridge the safest route. But if they find another solution, that's awesome. Just like I always say, you need to be constantly looking for ways and opportunities to pivot and change your plans in case and when the need arises. But what about another example? What if your players cross a group of owl bears? That's pretty cool. A cool monster setting, at least for me, is usually a fun little gimmicky kind of hook, but this can really be anything. I just happen to be using owl bears for this example, but you could just easily replace it with a dragon, a moat, a bridge, a complex social encounter, or even one of your players' long-lost relatives, just whatever suits your needs in the story you're telling. But for now, it's owl bears. It's a cool hook, and there's definitely a challenge, so it has action, but what's the goal? There's no real reason for your players to really want to interact with them and really engage in this encounter in the first place. So how do we fix this? That's an important question, isn't it? Well, what if the owl bears have something your players want or block somewhere your players need to go? The same thing goes for the other possibilities that I briefly mentioned a moment ago. For example, if one of your players comes across a long-lost relative, maybe the relative is in some kind of trouble or wants something. Bonus points if you can have this feed directly into the action by infecting some kind of conflict into it. Speaking of the action, let's move right along and focus on this one next. What happens when you end up neglecting the action? Well, let's look at this as I've been doing this episode with an example. I find that's the easiest way of dealing with these kinds of matters. What if your players come across a sleeping monster in the room they have to get through? Not only is this really fun and an encounter that I love using, but it's actually pretty solid for a minor encounter. Whatever brought them into the room is the hook, getting across is the goal, and the creature asleep on the floor makes up for the action. But let's change that. If we take away the constraints that is the room that this takes place in, there's no more challenge. They can just walk around, and that's fine every now and then, but again, with more important encounters, you're going to want all these parts for the most part. And with the action, as I just hinted to, this often comes down to setting realistic and well-defined constraints. If you think about it, this is all combat really is, a constraint. Your players don't get through without a fight. But for ways to increase the difficulty of a combat encounter, come back next week. Also, come back next week for a story about a character that I more recently played. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you visit for the next one. Until then, let's learn something.